Hi, my dear sleepless historian. Come closer. Not too close. Some of these royals had hygiene issues. Tonight, we're going to tuck ourselves into bed with a collection of kings who, let's just say, misused their royal privileges in the most eyebrow-raising ways possible. This isn't your high school history class. This is the part they left out, the footnotes that smelled faintly of scandal and perfume. No wars, no treaties, just powdered wigs, whispered rumors, and very poor decisions made in silk bed sheets. So dim the lights, set down your crown, and let me tell you why medieval monarchs were, quite frankly, too horny to govern. Let's begin, not with a battle, nor a coronation, but with a king, in velvet robes, curled hair, and eyes that followed one man far more closely than any war map. Edward of Caernarfon became King Edward II of England in 1307, and from the very beginning, he did not behave like the kings before him. He liked music more than military drills. He preferred thatching roofs and digging ditches to jousting tournaments, and when it came to company, he didn't care much for the noble daughters handpicked by his advisors. Instead, his heart and most of his political disasters revolved around one man, Piers Gaveston. Now, who was Gaveston? Not a noble, not a war hero, just a handsome Gascon knight, dashing, arrogant, and charming enough to make every other lord in England see red. Edward adored him, and not quietly. He made Gaveston the Earl of Cornwall, a title normally reserved for royal blood. He lavished him with jewels, lands, a wardrobe more extravagant than the Queen's, and when Edward married Princess Isabella of France, he spent more time with Gaveston than with his new bride. At the royal wedding banquet, Gaveston wore cloth of gold and outshone the bride entirely. He reportedly made crude jokes, danced, and accepted tribute from nobles like he was the one wearing the crown. The nobility was not amused. Now imagine this from the eyes of a medieval noble. You're sitting at a long oak table, cold mutton in one hand, trying not to blink too fast as the king's favorite swirls past in perfume and pearls, and then the king raises his goblet, toasts Gaveston, and invites him to sit at the head of the table, above the queen. This wasn't royal discretion. This was a public, provocative affair, flamboyant, unapologetic, and deeply insulting to the most powerful families in the realm. They tolerated it for a time, but when Gaveston began mocking them openly, calling one earl a catamite and another a whoreson, the nobles had had enough. In 1308, they forced Edward to exile him. And Edward did, but only after throwing what historians politely call a spectacle of grief. He wept, he sulked, he refused to attend councils, he wandered aimlessly like a heartbroken teen with too much land. But Gaveston came back, again and again. Every time he was exiled, Edward found a way to bring him home, like a stray cat in gold embroidery. Eventually, the barons took drastic action. In 1312, they kidnapped Gaveston, and then, without trial, they executed him. On a lonely hill outside Warwick Castle, Edward was not just devastated, he was undone. From that moment, his rule fractured. He turned paranoid, erratic, and emotionally volatile. His political decisions became personal vendettas. He married into alliances that turned into hostilities, and most critically, he ignored his wife, Isabella, a woman who would eventually lead an invasion against him. Because Edward, for all his titles, had a fatal flaw. He never learned to hide his desires. He never played the royal game. He led with his heart, and that heart beat only for one man. Now, let's talk about the end. The fall of Edward II is one of the most whispered about chapters in royal history. Deposed by his own wife and her lover, imprisoned in a damp stone castle, he became a prisoner of the crown he once wore, and then the infamous rumor that he was murdered with a red-hot poker inserted where no medieval candle should ever go. Was it true? Historians debated. But the fact that it felt plausible says everything about how strange and scandalous his reign had become. And with that chapter closed, we turn now to another crown, another court, and another king who didn't bother hiding his appetites at all. Where Edward gave his heart to one man and brought down a kingdom, this next monarch gave himself to everyone and kept the throne anyway. Let us now slip into the gilded chaos of Restoration England and meet the man history nicknamed, quite simply, the Merry Monarch. After the beheadings, the Puritans, and the grey frost of Cromwell's England, the monarchy returned in 1660 with velvet slippers, perfume, and a king who laughed in the face of solemnity. Charles II of England stepped into power as if stepping onto a stage. He had witnessed the execution of his father, wandered Europe in exile, and lived on borrowed favors and thin promises. So when he finally reclaimed the English throne, he did not waste time on restraint. He had one philosophy, often repeated: "Let not poor Nelly starve." And with that phrase, aimed at one of his many mistresses, Charles began the most openly indulgent reign England had seen in generations. He was tall, dark-haired, charismatic, a king who preferred parties to parliaments, and who turned Whitehall into something between a royal court and a masquerade ball. Charles had no fewer than 13 acknowledged mistresses, and likely many more who were never formally recorded, because royal record-keeping drew the line at tavern dancers and opera singers with no titles. There was Barbara Villiers, the tempestuous brunette who bore him 5 children and once slapped a noble in full view of the court. There was Nell Gwynn, a witty orange seller turned actress, who referred to herself publicly as the Protestant whore, a pointed jab at Charles's Catholic mistresses. There was Louise de Querouaille, a French beauty with a pension from Louis XIV, who was elegant, calculating, and entirely fluent in the art of diplomacy through seduction. And then there was Lucy Walter, his first serious mistress, who claimed their son, the Duke of Monmouth, was legitimate, sparking years of succession rumors and political unrest. Charles acknowledged many of his illegitimate children, knighted them, titled them, and placed them into powerful positions. It was the closest thing to monarchy by sheer charisma the realm had ever seen. But beneath the velvet and gossip, his reign was not without weight. He navigated a country still bleeding from civil war, managed competing religious factions, and oversaw the rebuilding of London after the Great Fire of 1666. He attended scientific demonstrations, met with Isaac Newton, and helped charter the Royal Society, all while maintaining a nightly calendar of theatre, gambling, and candlelit visits to various duchesses. He was not faithful, he was not discreet, but he was remarkably liked, and therein lay the mystery. How did a king so consumed by his appetites, so brazen in his affairs, maintain a firm grasp on power? Because Charles, unlike Edward II, knew how to play the game. He flirted with Parliament, balanced court factions, and made himself indispensable. He gave just enough attention to statecraft to keep rebellion at bay, and just enough spectacle to make England forget the grey years of Puritan rule. He once said, "I am the King of England, and I will be obeyed." But he delivered it with a smirk, a flourish, and perhaps a lipstick stain on his collar. In his final years, Charles converted quietly to Catholicism, a last-minute surprise that caused more rumors than revolutions. He died in 1685, with humor intact, apologizing to the courtiers around his deathbed. "I'm sorry, gentlemen, for being such a long time dying." He was buried with little ceremony. His mistresses wept. His illegitimate children inherited titles, land, and scandal. And England exhaled, not with relief, but with the curious, conflicted grief reserved for charming men who broke every rule, yet left the room better lit than they found it. And now, the party fades. The candles dim. We move next to a king who ruled not with charm, but with cold power, and a quiet court filled with secrets, trials, and the scent of burning parchment. He didn't throw lavish banquets. He tightened his grip and watched kingdoms fall beneath it. Our next chapter leads us to Philip IV of France, a king whose vices wore velvet gloves and whose enemies vanished like smoke. If Charles II was velvet and laughter, then Philip IV of France was stone and silence. Where other monarchs ruled from gilded halls, Philip ruled from the shadows, calculating, composed, and dangerously patient. Born in 1268 and crowned in 1285, Philip IV, later called Philip the Fair, was not fair in the sense of kindness or justice. His nickname referred only to his appearance, tall, striking, with pale skin and flaxen hair. Behind those icy blue eyes, however, lay a ruler of chilling resolve. Philip's France was not a place of dancing and decadence. It was a kingdom of order, law, and deep-rooted control. He strengthened the monarchy, reformed the legal system, and centralized power like a king who understood that charm fades. But bureaucracy endures. But even under layers of order and crown-polished diplomacy, the rumors stirred. Philip's court was unusually quiet for its time. Few grand festivities, fewer public mistresses, but whispers traveled faster than banners. There were tales of obsession with moral discipline, and of a king who punished not for love of virtue, but for fear of what chaos might reveal. And then came the scandal that tore through the royal house like wildfire. The Tour de Nes l'affaire. In 1314, Philip accused 3 of his own daughters-in-law, all married to his sons, of adultery with 2 Norman knights. The accusations came from Philip's own daughter, Isabella, Queen of England, and future architect of Edward II's downfall. The charges were salacious: rendezvous in the towers of Paris, love tokens exchanged, and stolen moments behind stone walls. The accused knights were arrested, tortured, and confessed to bedding not 1, but 2 of the princesses. They were executed gruesomely, flayed and hanged in public, their bodies left to rot in the sun. As for the women, 1 was acquitted. 2 were imprisoned for life, their heads shaved, locked in remote castles as disgraced royalty. It was not only a family scandal, it was a dynastic crisis. The affair shattered the public image of the royal family, called the succession into question, and ushered in a period of instability that would eventually lead to the end of the Capetian line and the beginnings of the 100 Years' War. But what made the Tour de Nesle affair more than just gossip was the silence that followed. Philip never explained why he acted with such severity. Some said it was about honor. Others believed it was about control. But behind his mask of icy piety, many wondered if he was deflecting attention from his own secrets. He had expelled the Jews from France, crushed the powerful Knights Templar, and seized enormous wealth from both. And through it all, he maintained the image of a solemn, devout king, even as he funded wars with plundered silver and burned men who had once blessed his crown. Philip IV died unexpectedly in 1314 after a hunting accident. His sons, each haunted by scandal and unprepared for rule, would die young, leaving the crown vulnerable to foreign claims. France would soon be plunged into dynastic chaos. But Philip? He left no apologies, only a paper trail of indictments and silence. He remains a mystery, a monarch whose reign shaped the future of Europe, yet whose personal life remains an enigma of locked doors and cautious steps. He was not indulgent like Edward, not flamboyant like Charles, but power in his hands became something colder, sharper. The court was clean, the punishment swift, and the whispers, though soft, never truly stopped. Now, as the smoke of burned parchments and broken vows fades into memory, we turn to a different sort of king, one who wore desire on his sleeve, changed wives like wardrobes, and left a trail of broken alliances in the wake of his appetites. A king who didn't hide scandal. He institutionalized it. The next chapter takes us across the Channel to a monarch who dissolved monasteries, defied the Pope, and married so many times that historians needed spreadsheets. Prepare now for the reign of Henry VIII, a king of appetites, ambition, and consequences. He's the monarch school children remember for all the wrong reasons. The one who married 6 times. The one who beheaded his queens. The one who split from the Catholic Church not for theology, but for lust. Henry VIII of England was not born to be king. He was the spare, not the heir, the second son of Henry VII. But when his elder brother Arthur died unexpectedly, the crown, the kingdom, and Arthur's widow all passed into young Henry's orbit. He was athletic, educated, and charming in his early years, fluent in multiple languages, skilled in music and sport. Henry was the Renaissance prince England had dreamed of. But beneath the poetry and tournaments lay a restless hunger for power, for control, and for women who could produce sons. His first wife was Catherine of Aragon, widow of his brother, daughter of Spain, and fiercely devout. Their marriage lasted over 2 decades. She gave him a daughter, Mary, but no surviving sons. As Catherine aged, Henry's patience thinned. He became increasingly desperate for a male heir, and increasingly infatuated with a lady of the court, Anne Boleyn. Anne was witty, clever, and ambitious. She refused to become a mistress. If Henry wanted her, he would have to marry her. And so, he did what no English king had done before. He defied the Pope. When the Vatican refused to annul his marriage to Catherine, Henry declared himself head of the Church of England. He severed ties with Rome, seized church lands, and rewrote the spiritual hierarchy of an entire nation, just to put a different woman in his bed. It was bold. It was reckless. It was very Henry. He married Anne Boleyn in secret. Soon after she gave birth, not to the son he longed for, but to another daughter, Elizabeth. The marriage quickly soured. Anne, who had once captivated the court, found herself isolated, scrutinized, and increasingly unable to bear more children. In 1536, she was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. The evidence was thin. The trial was swift. She was executed by sword, not axe, as a grim courtesy for a fallen queen. Henry remarried 11 days later. His third wife, Jane Seymour, finally gave him a son, Edward, before dying of childbirth complications. Henry would later call her his true wife, perhaps because she didn't live long enough to displease him. 3 queens in, 3 dramatically different endings. His fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, was chosen through a portrait. But when Henry met her in person, he found her, in his words, ugly as a Flanders mare. The marriage was annulled. She survived, and even received a generous settlement and a comfortable retirement. His fifth wife, Catherine Howard, was a teenage cousin of Anne Boleyn, flirtatious, lively, and indiscreet. She had affairs, or at least the appearance of them. She was executed, too. Then came his sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, a widow twice over, with a calming presence and a clever mind. She outlived him. By the end of his life, Henry had grown bloated and irritable. He suffered from ulcerated legs, paranoia, and mounting regret. Gone was the golden prince of youth. In his place sat a monarch who had torn a nation from the Pope, dissolved centuries of monasteries, and left behind a string of political and personal wreckage. Yet even in his worst moments, he ruled with unwavering authority. His charm may have faded, but his iron will remained until his final breath. Henry VIII died in 1547, leaving behind a son too sickly to rule long, 2 daughters with competing visions for England, and a legacy soaked in blood, broken vows, and unrelenting power. He redefined monarchy not through diplomacy or reform, but by sheer force of ego and a royal bedroom that changed the course of history. Now, as the echo of marching boots and crumpled marriage contracts fades, our story moves onward to a different land and a different kind of scandal, a king who ruled Castile, but loved too openly, and defied tradition not through violence, but through stubborn public devotion to a woman who was never crowned queen. Next, we enter the strange, scandal-soaked world of Alfonso XI of Castile. In the rocky hills and sun-drenched plains of medieval Castile, royal drama didn't always come with executioners and excommunications. Sometimes it came with silence, with a wife kept in a tower, and a mistress who wore no crown, yet ruled the king's heart. Alfonso XI of Castile was born in 1311. He ascended the throne at just 1 year old, after his father's early death, and his childhood was a carousel of regents, feuding nobles, and near anarchy. But Alfonso was no puppet for long. By age 14, he declared himself ready to rule. By 20, he had wrestled power back from the factions, and by 25, he was a king not to be crossed. He was clever, authoritative, a military strategist. He fought against the Moors, took Gibraltar, and enforced centralized control over Castilian nobles with a firm, unrelenting hand. But it wasn't military conquest that made Alfonso famous in Castilian memory. It was love, or rather, defiance, cloaked in affection. He was married in 1328 to Maria of Portugal, a royal union designed for politics, not pleasure. She was noble, proper, well-bred, and Alfonso ignored her entirely. Instead, he fell deeply and publicly for Leonor de Guzman, a noblewoman of remarkable wit, beauty, and ambition. Their affair was not a secret. Leonor wasn't kept in shadows or silken back rooms. She moved into the royal palace. She bore Alfonso 10 children. She received titles, lands, and royal protection. And Queen Maria? She was exiled from court, pushed to the margins of royal life. She lived out her days surrounded by whispers and humiliation, while Leonor was treated, for all intents and purposes, as the queen in everything but name. It was unprecedented, even by medieval standards. A king might keep a mistress, but to replace a queen in public life, to fund the rival family, to raise illegitimate sons to noble titles. It was more than passion. It was political rebellion. The court murmured. Portugal, Maria's homeland, protested. Even the church expressed dismay. But Alfonso didn't budge. He rewarded Leonor's loyalty with estates. He gave her children high-ranking marriages. He built her a legacy that would echo for generations. And when he died suddenly in 1350, from plague, during a military campaign, he left behind not just a fractured kingdom, but a royal house torn between two lines, because Queen Maria, long silent, finally acted. She had Leonor arrested, imprisoned, and ultimately killed. Not in battle, not by noble decree, but in a remote fortress where silence once again reclaimed its place beside power. Alfonso XI is remembered today as both a strong king and a stubborn man, a monarch who preserved the stability of Castile while risking its reputation for the sake of love. His reign is a paradox, an iron-fisted ruler and a heart utterly unwilling to bow. He didn't break with the church. He didn't rewrite the laws. But by refusing to hide the woman he loved, he exposed just how fragile tradition could be when it stood in the path of desire. And so, history closes the chapter on yet another crown, worn not just on the brow, but in the restless, unruly chambers of the human heart. Now, with Castilian sun setting in the distance, our tale travels north, to the icy edges of Scandinavia, to a man called Eric of Pomerania, a king whose reign was so plagued by scandal, mismanagement, and rumors of bathhouse intrigue that he lost not one throne, but 3. He began his reign as a royal prodigy, crowned young, blessed by popes, and gifted not one throne, but 3. By the end, he was exiled, broke, and rumored to be running a pirate base from a windswept island. This is the story of Eric of Pomerania, a man whose royal resume was impressive, and whose fall from grace was equally legendary. Eric was born around 1381 in what is now northwestern Poland. He wasn't born to rule. He was a minor noble, plucked from obscurity by his grandaunt, Queen Margaret I of Denmark, one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe. Margaret had no surviving children. She needed an heir, one she could mold, control, and groom to inherit her legacy. Eric was bright, beautiful, trainable, and soon, at just 15 years old, he was crowned King of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, a personal union known as the Kalmar Union. It was a triple crown, a rare and complicated arrangement, and for a while it worked. Eric ruled beside Margaret until her death in 1412. He inherited her power, her court, and all of her enemies. What followed was decades of slow unraveling. Eric was idealistic but stubborn. He introduced reforms, raised taxes, and tried to centralize power, all while ignoring the deeply regional politics of Scandinavia. He waged endless wars with the Hanseatic League, a powerful trade alliance that didn't take kindly to royal meddling. He raised tolls, seized ships, made aggressive moves that infuriated merchants, and drained his treasury. But his downfall wasn't just about economics or bad diplomacy. It was also about image, and Eric's image began to shift. He was accused of neglecting his duties, of living in luxury while his people starved, of spending too much time in bathhouses, drifting between relaxation and rumor. There were whispers of lovers, of exotic guests, of long, steamy afternoons while royal correspondents gathered dust. No one knows exactly what happened behind those ornate doors, but the perception of indulgence was enough. By the 1430s, rebellions flared, first in Sweden, then in Denmark, then finally even Norway, the most loyal of the three, turned against him. One by one, he lost his thrones. And then, something strange happened. Eric didn't flee in disgrace. He didn't vanish into a monastery or seek exile in Rome. Instead, he retreated to the island of Gotland and set up shop in Visby, a once thriving port town that had fallen on hard times. And there, the former king reinvented himself. He became a pirate, or at least a pirate king. He organized raids on Hanseatic ships. He charged illegal tolls. He harassed trade routes and antagonized his enemies with the same theatrical flair he had once brought to royal court. Even in disgrace, Eric clung to control. He lived on Gotland for over a decade, a self-appointed sovereign of a crumbling stone island, surrounded by loyal retainers, salty winds, and the smell of plundered cargo. Eventually, he returned to Pomerania, not as a king, but as a quiet duke, tucked away from the politics of thrones. He died in 1459. No crown, no rebellion, just a legacy so strange, so tangled, that historians still debate whether he was a tragic idealist or a man who simply loved the perks of power more than its responsibilities. Eric of Pomerania remains one of medieval history's great contradictions, crowned 3 times, toppled 3 times, and remembered, not for glory, but for the long theatrical exit. Now, as the sails fade on the Baltic horizon and the scent of salt and scandal drifts away, the story begins to soften. Because for all their power, indulgence, and public sins, these kings were still human. Some ruled with their hearts, some with their egos, and some, like Eric, with too much bath water and not enough caution. And now, the voices fade, the feasts are over, the silk robes lie empty on cold stone floors, and the kings, with all their lust and titles, their whispered lovers and crumbling crowns, slip quietly into the hush of memory. They reigned with desire, with arrogance, with desperation. They defied the church, disowned their queens, and clung to the illusion that power could love them back. But in the end, it was always the same. The throne outlasted the body. The scandal outlived the soul. Their names, Edward, Charles, Philip, Henry, Alfonso, Eric, etched into stained parchment, frozen in the silence of broken chapels and sunlit ruins. One chased love and lost a kingdom. One turned the palace into a playground. One buried secrets beneath layers of order. One rewrote a nation for the shape of a womb. One wore his mistress like a badge of war. And one simply let it all drift away on sea mist and pride. History remembers the crowns, but beneath them were men, fragile, greedy, aching men who wanted more than power. They wanted to be adored, obeyed, held. But tonight, there are no judgments, no parliaments, no axes or annulments or locked towers, only stillness, the kind that settles on abandoned castles, where tapestries rot gently and candle smoke lingers in the rafters long after the music ends. This is the softness history rarely gives us, a moment to lie still among the ruins, to let the chaos slow and the past finally exhale. So rest now. Let the kings stumble back into shadow. Let the stories fade to silk and ash. Let the cold stones grow warm again. You've traveled through centuries of scandal and arrived not at the guillotine or the council chamber, but at the quiet place where all stories sleep. Here there are no affairs to hide, no crowns to wear, no thrones to lose. Just breathe and sleep, and the gentle whisper of time letting go. Good night.